Good morning, everybody. My name is John Greenwood. I'm the chief economist at Invesco, which is an asset management company. But I like to straddle the business world and the academic world. So I really enjoy participating in conferences like this. And I want to thank Tim Congdon, Juan Castaneda, and especially Gail Grimston for all the organization and helping to make it possible. The paper that I've prepared in conjunction with Steve Hanke of the Johns Hopkins University is entitled, so the theme for that we were assigned by the conference organizers was on monetary growth and inflation in leading economies 2021-2022. And we've chosen to emphasize the difference between relative prices and overall prices for reasons that I'll make clear, but basically there's a huge amount of confusion in the popular commentary and indeed among professional economists between the two. And basically a lot of people are saying that changes in relative prices that we are seeing constitute inflation. And I'll elaborate more on that as we go through. Now, we start the paper by saying that there have always been really only two explanations of inflation. One explanation, which goes back hundreds of years, is that inflation is a monetary phenomenon created by an excess of the quantity of money over the rate of economic growth and the desire of the public at large and firms to hold money. So there are those two reasons why people want to hold money. You have to finance growth, and you want to, as people get richer, they tend to want to hold more money as part of their overall financial asset portfolio. And that those things are very stable and constant, well, not constant, but they're very stable over a period of time. That's and going back centuries, so there were silver discoveries, gold discoveries in the 16th, 17th centuries and 19th century, and they were the prominent, or the most prominent determinant of the increase in the quantity of money. But since we've moved to a fiat money system, we also have to take that into account, and there have been many reasons why fiat money has increased. But again, the monetary theory says that if you increase the quantity of money, whether it's under a fiat standard or a metallic standard, gold standard or silver standard, you will get inflation if you increase the quantity of money too much in relation to growth and the demand for increased money balances. So that's the monetary explanation, which held through metallic standards periods or real gold and silver standard periods and through fiat money periods. There is another set of theories, which we call, at the beginning of our paper, ad hoc theories. Now, these are theories which are regularly trotted out by economists and central bankers and commentators around the world. And they say that inflation is due to things like labor unions pushing up demands for wages, monopolists pushing up the price of scarce materials or resources. Currently, the favored ad hoc explanation is that inflation is all to do with the disruption and breakdown of supply chains. So everywhere you read that we're getting inflation because supply chains have been disrupted because of the COVID pandemic. And as I say, that is a confusion of relative prices with overall prices. There are actually two things going on. We have had a big shift in relative prices, number one, but also in some countries, we've had big changes which are going to drive shifts in the overall price level. And it's important to understand the difference between those two. Now, before we look at the present, what I want to do is to review the trends of the past 30 years pre-COVID. So I'm going to look at price trends in the period 1990. Oops, sorry, going the wrong way. Can I go to the next slide, please? 1990 to, okay. So the next few slides are all 1990 to 2019. And what I want you to observe, we're going to go country by country. First of all, this is the United States. And as you can see, we're looking at the overall consumer price index. That's the dark blue line, all items. And then I've split it into the behavior of goods prices and the behavior of service prices. Goods prices, you can see, since about 1995, have been generally falling, whereas service prices tend to rise at something like 3%, 3 and a bit percent, maybe sometimes 4% on average. Now, the consumer price index is a weighted average of those two, and as a result, the CPI kind of goes along closer to the service index because services account for about 80% of a modern economy. And in the US, well, that's roughly the ratio, a little bit, 85%, and that's why you get that pattern. But this is, so goods prices tended to be falling, service prices tended to be rising more than the CPI, and as a result, we've had this pattern. Next. Next, the UK, you see exactly the same sort of phenomenon. Goods prices tended to be falling, but there have been episodes when they've risen, and service prices generally rising much more rapidly than the CPI overall. And again, the overall CPI is a weighted average of goods and service prices, and so it runs along the middle there, biased slightly towards the service side. Again, this is the period pre-COVID. And the next one is the Eurozone, where again, you see the same sort of thing, but because Eurozone inflation was lower, these lines are all more compressed together. There's not so much differentiation. I've put over on the far left-hand side in all of these, I'm sorry, I should have drawn attention to it, the average changes. We'll have a table on that in a moment. But as you can see, same pattern prevails by and large, not all the time, but mostly. And then if we look at Japan, this is the fourth country, we had certainly that pattern prevailing until 2005, but since then, Japan has had a couple of increases in the consumption tax, and that's hit goods more than services, and as a result, Japan's seen goods prices rise a bit more than service prices in recent years. But basically, the story is for these four major countries, the US, the UK, the Eurozone, and Japan, that we've had generally falling goods prices, but rising service prices, and service prices rising quite a bit more. So there you have a neat summary of it. This is the average rate of change of goods prices and service prices in the first two columns for each country. And then in the right-hand column, all items, and you can see that that is in between those two. So this general pattern prevailed for the last 30 years. So what was behind this? And why have things changed? Well, what's changed things is COVID-19. Because of the lockdown, all kinds of service activities saw drastic declines in their sales, in their activity levels, and in employment. Now, these are figures for US personal consumption expenditure in real terms. The top line is for services, and you can see that from that dashed line, the last point near the dashed line, if I can highlight it, I'm not sure it's working, but anyway, is 2019, fourth quarter of 2019. You can see there was an overall drop by the second quarter of 15% in real terms. That's a huge drop. Since then, there's been some recovery, but we're still not back to trend. Conversely, spending on goods has skyrocketed. It's up by 29, or in the second quarter of this year, it was up by 29% compared with pre-COVID. So you've had this huge divergence of spending, and that has naturally had an impact on prices. If people are bidding for goods because they're locked down and they're buying more computers, more games, more garden furniture, a better barbecue, more furniture, they're making an extension of the house, they're doing all those things because of lockdown, and that these goods are being delivered to their door by Amazon or somebody like that, whereas they can't travel, they can't go to restaurants, they can't go to movies, so service spending is down sharply. Naturally, that has had an impact on prices. So now we're going to look at what's happened to prices in the recent period, 2018 to 2021. So just the last 4 years. And as you see at the left-hand side of the chart, goods prices were still falling relative to the overall CPI. Service prices rising more rapidly. Exactly what I pointed out to you was the trend of the past 30 years. But then COVID occurs, and look what happens. Goods prices have soared, and service prices are lagging behind. So we've had a reversal of this relative price trend. In the US, and this was data for the US, goods prices in October were up by 13.2% over the previous year. Service prices up just 3.7%. Notice that the all items number is also up. That's the figure that Juan quoted just now. The October figure was 6.2% for all items in the Consumer Price Index. We'll come on to that in a few moments, but I want to show you that this trend is general. First of all, make sure that I've got the right one. Yeah, okay. Let me step back a moment and give you a longer perspective on this. Here I'm showing you not the year-on-year rate of change, but the level of the Consumer Price Index and its two components that we've just been looking at. So the durable goods, which actually with non-durable goods, things like food, constitutes total goods. And then services. So services plus durable goods plus non-durable goods make up the full Consumer Price Index. And what you'll see here is very interesting. The data starts in 1956. And by and large, those prices for goods and services moved in tandem together up until 1978. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping started the 4 modernizations and the opening up of China. And that meant that factories in China could be started up by entrepreneurs in Hong Kong initially, and then by entrepreneurs in the mainland. And China started to produce goods in a significant way. And in 1985, what you see is a divergence in the behavior of durable goods prices and service prices. Durable goods prices are still rising, but they're not rising nearly as rapidly as service prices. And then from September 1996, durable goods prices start falling. So this basically what's happening is China is producing more and more cheap manufactured goods using its cheap labor, its cheap land, its cheap factories, and so on. And it's competing in this area. So China is having an effect on relative prices, but not on the overall price index. And to sort of digress here for a moment, the popular narrative that we all hear is that China has spent the last 30 years exporting deflation. And what I'm going to show you is that that is completely false. Milton Friedman said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But we can add to that by saying that inflation is always and everywhere a local phenomenon. That is to say, it's a product of monetary policy, or more accurately, monetary growth in the country concerned. And every country can choose its monetary policy. Of course, they can peg their exchange rate to another country, in which case they basically have to follow what's happening to monetary conditions in that country. But it's their choice, and they could do something different. So the overall inflation rate in the US didn't change drastically, but the composition of prices changed because China was exporting not overall deflation, but it was exporting much lower relative prices for labor and manufactured goods. And that had an impact on manufacturing wages throughout the Western economies, because factories were being undercut in Europe and North America. And as a result, there was a lot of shifting of resources over to China, to make these manufactured goods. So for the next few years, from 1996 until COVID, the right-hand side here, durable goods prices were falling. And I can show you that in another way too, using not the CPI, but the components of the deflator for personal consumption expenditure in the United States. So the total is the total personal consumption expenditure deflator, and that's split into services, non-durables, and durables. Non-durables is things, as I say, like food and clothing, which we use for a while and then we dispose of. But notice that from the peak of that durables pricing increase, they declined by nearly 40%, by 39.5%. But since then, they've risen by 9%. Those are changes in relative prices. And it's this increase in 9% that the team transitory are saying is inflation. And they're saying, because that won't last, we'll go back to falling goods prices. We won't, the inflation will disappear. And I'm going to show you that that is wrong. Now, just a quick tour of some other countries. Another point, if you go further up the supply chain from consumer prices to producer prices, you get much bigger movements. So things like producer goods for inputs for manufacturing and so on tend to rise much more. There's raw materials prices and intermediate goods prices. They tend to rise much more. So this is data for the United States, but these increases tend to be absorbed in margins, so they don't necessarily show up in the CPI. Moving to the Eurozone, we see the same pattern, that shift, that reversal. Here's the left-hand side, you can see that magenta or purple line declining, but then with COVID halfway through 2020, latter part of 2020, goods prices start rising much more rapidly, and service prices are now lagging behind, and the overall price index is also rising. So Europe seems to be following the US, and that's why people in team transitory say, well, this is a general phenomenon caused by supply chain problems. Wrong. If we look at now further up the supply chain in Europe, we have the same sort of thing. Producer prices rising very rapidly, over 15–16% for the Eurozone as a whole. Import prices rising sharply, but the CPI more modestly, and the GDP deflator still, well, we don't have up-to-date data for the Eurozone, but basically that's going to be broadly in line with the CPI. For the UK, we have the same sort of picture. On the left-hand side, those goods prices tended to be falling, and then we've got the reversal with COVID, and goods prices now rising more rapidly. But notice again that these prices are much more compressed together. Goods prices rising 4.9%, service prices rising 3.2% year over year for October, and all items 4.2%. I think this is partly, well, I have some explanation in the paper. I won't go into it now, it's not important. But Now, so much for our sort of three major areas, the US, the UK, the Eurozone. What about Japan? Japan is a different story. As I said to you, Japan's goods prices tended to be rising a bit more, partly because of the consumption tax increases. But they've nevertheless seen a big jump in goods prices as a result of the pandemic, and service prices are lagging behind. Japan has had exactly the same supply chain problems that every other country has had. So why aren't they seeing overall prices rising? Because their all items, you can see, is only 0.1. Japan does not have inflation at the generalized level. What about China? Well, for those of you who don't know, China is very interesting because it's kind of, it's a special case because first of all, they had something called African swine flu during 2019-2020. The staple meat in China is pork. They have very large herds of pigs, which are bred for the food market. And because of the African swine flu, large numbers of pigs had to be slaughtered, and that food couldn't, that never reached the restaurants or the shopping areas. So as a result, food prices rose very strongly in China over that period, and food makes up roughly 30% of the overall consumer price index in China. So the purple line, that magenta purplish line, rose very sharply, and the overall CPI also rose quite sharply during that period. But actually, that's a relative price increase. Here, in the Chinese case, because we don't have a sort of full breakdown, goods includes food. And then service prices were more subdued, which is different, right, from what we had in other countries. But then look what's happened recently. Service prices have risen, but goods prices have fallen. The goods prices are actually reflecting the unwind of that big spike in prices in 2019-20. So that's reversing. And now we're seeing goods prices falling. But this is temporary, but it just shows you that relative price movements can be different according to different countries. But what I want to draw your attention to is the overall all item number, which in October was up only 1.5%. Nobody would say that China is having a serious episode of inflation. So what is the difference between Japan and China on the one hand, which both have had supply chain disruptions, but neither of them have inflation? What is the difference between them and what's happened in these Western countries? Now, before I answer that question, what I want to do is to take you through 6 episodes from monetary history. Now, these concern the 2 oil crises in the 1970s for Japan, the UK, and the Eurozone. We start with Japan because Japan tells you everything you need to know. So first of all, you probably all remember from your study that the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates was terminated by President Nixon closing the gold window in August 1971. Japan was a big exporting country at that time, and it was very nervous about what would happen if the yen appreciated. So what did the authorities do? They eased monetary conditions. And as you can see here, money growth on the right-hand axis went on the left-hand side from about 16% rate of growth, surged to 25% and remained there for about 2 years before slowing down sharply. So this is 1971, 1972, and then 1973. It was October of 1973 that OPEC raised, or they curtailed oil output. And as a result, Japanese import prices shot up on the left-hand axis by 70%. Producer prices increased by about 30-35%, and consumer prices increased by a horrific 25% at the peak. Now, I've got very strong memories of this because I was a student in China at the time, not China, I was a student in Japan at the time, and I was on a Japanese government scholarship. I was being given as a stipend 36,000 yen per month, which at the exchange rate at the time translated into about $130, $140 per month. So I had a pretty tight budget. And for some days, I was living on a bowl of rice if I didn't have resources of my own. Basically, as you can see, prices rose dramatically. What was it? Was it OPEC that pushed the prices up? No, it was not. It was that huge increase in money growth in the 2 years preceding the first oil crisis, which drove up prices. The gap or the time lag between that peak in money growth and the peak in domestic inflation was exactly 2 years, precisely what Milton Friedman and others, Anna Schwartz and others, found in their empirical studies across many countries, across many eras. So that 2-year time lag played out perfectly. It happened that OPEC took advantage of strong demand globally to curtail the output of oil, and that pushed prices up. So they rode that advantage very well, very successfully. But it was not what you hear from the popular narrative, which is that the oil price increases caused the inflation of 1973-74. Now, Japan learned from this example, and in 1974, July 1974, the Bank of Japan made an announcement that henceforth they would control the rate of growth of money. And so they did, not on a sort of month by month, week by week, day by day basis, but in a general way and gradually bring it down. And you can see the money growth rate, starting on the left-hand side of the chart in 1976, gradually came down from about 20%, gradually down towards about 10%. And of course, that was going to have an impact. OPEC raised prices again in 1979, and Japanese import prices this time again rose by about 70%. Japan was importing all its oil and gas, all its fuel needs. Producer prices rose somewhat less. They're a wider index because they include all kinds of other things as well. They only rose by about 20%. And then consumer prices only rose by 8%. Now, 8% might sound like a high number to you today, but in those days, Japan had, under Bretton Woods, had frequently had price increases of 5, 6, 7% under something called the Balassa-Samuelson terms because of the rapid growth of productivity in Japan relative to the US. And so there were divergences in the non-traded goods prices. In any case, that is a remarkable achievement. So Japan really learned from the first oil crisis. If you control money, you don't control relative prices, but you can control the overall price level. And that's exactly what Japan did. Now, let's have a look at the experience. So this is the summary. There are the two episodes. On the left, the first episode and CPI going up to 25%. The second oil crisis, only 8.6% of the peak. That, I think, is a brilliant lesson in monetary economics. Now, what about the UK? Did they learn from the first oil crisis? Sadly not. Just like Japan, you can see ahead of the first oil crisis, UK had huge increases in money growth, over 20% for 2 years. And then not surprisingly, as a result of that, the retail price index, as it was then, we didn't have the CPI, increased at the peak on the left-hand scale by over 20%. I don't know, Tim, if you remember the precise. Yeah, okay. Okay, so that's the UK case in first oil crisis, second oil crisis. They didn't control money, and as a result, basically the increase in prices was replicated. And it's the same case for the US. Here you see on the left, US huge increase in money before the first oil crisis and a huge increase after the first oil crisis, which incidentally didn't show up in the CPI, this time not for 2 years, but for 3 years. So the lags are variable. So now then, we were asked to talk about inflation in a whole range of countries. So this is the key table. Across the top, we've chosen a number of countries: the US, Israel, UK, Australia, Eurozone, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Switzerland, and China. And we've chosen the appropriate broad money aggregate to follow. We've used standard numbers that are available to all of you. For some countries, it's better to construct your own, but for these purposes, this is perfectly adequate. Line 3 gives you the cumulative increase in money growth from February 2020, from the onset of the pandemic, to September 2021. That is the latest data that was available when we compiled this. Now, once you have that big increase, when you have those increases in money, some of that has to go to finance real GDP growth, the next line, and some of it goes to finance higher money balances in the next row. If you assume that we are pretty much 2 years from the onset of the pandemic, and you take those two lines, that's line 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you take 2 years of each of those and deduct those, you get the fifth line. So for the US, the cumulative money growth was 36.4. We deduct 4.8 for financing real GDP growth, the trend of GDP growth, and we deduct 3.4 for the increase in money balances. And then that gives us 8.2 percentage points in total. So that leaves us with 28.2. That is a point estimate of the amount of excess money in the US. And you can do the same. Israel has had very rapid money growth, and then the UK. So on the left-hand side, US, Israel, and UK are going to have relatively high inflation, or if you like, it's a sort of single event, an episode of inflation lifting the price level by roughly these amounts at the moment. Of course, we don't know what money growth is going to be in the future. The group in the middle, Australia, the Eurozone, Canada, more modest increases in excess money, and therefore more modest increases in the overall price level and inflation. And then the ones on the right, New Zealand, Japan, Switzerland, and China, hardly any excess money and therefore very low inflation. So that's kind of the content of our paper. I don't want to go on too long, but basically the story is that where money growth has been excessive, inflation is going to be a problem. Where it has not been excessive, inflation is not going to be a problem. Curiously, in the US, they don't accept this. And so I'll read this brief summary for you. The result is, because the US and other countries don't follow money, the result is a bizarre situation in which money growth is studied and followed in many developed economies and almost every emerging economy as a guide to future nominal income growth. But it is ignored or assumed to be irrelevant in the United States. Aside from being utterly unscientific, this attitude is comparable to maintaining that the law of gravity applies everywhere in the world except in the United States. I mean, it's just bizarre. However, experience is the best teacher. However much we argue they need to look at money, I don't think they'll pay any attention. Experience is the best teacher, just as it was not academic theorizing, but real world experience of simultaneously high inflation and high unemployment in the 1970s that was needed to expose the shortcomings of the Phillips curve relationship. Maybe we can dare to hope that the persistent inflation, not transitory, which is likely to prevail in the US in 2022 and 2023 as a result of the egregious growth of broad money in 2020 and 2021, will finally start to undermine at least some of the complacent assumptions of neo-Keynesian economics, and possibly even restore some credibility to the monetary theory of nominal national income determination. Thank you very much.